In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at different sampling techniques. So sampling is a way that we can gather data. But before we get into the different techniques, we want to look at just some definitions. Right. So a survey is a method of collecting information about a population. Right. So a survey, again, you can handle the survey, use it to gather information about a population. A census is something that collects information about each individual in the population, right? So a census is a survey, usually that the government kind of sends out, or at least that's the main, or that's one of the most common surveys or census. So the government will send it out. It will send it to pretty much almost every citizen or every person in the country, and ask them questions. Right. So it collects information about each individual in the population. Now, a sample is a group of individuals or items, depending on what we're dealing with, that are taken from a population. Right? So a population is the kind of entire group that we're looking at. A sample is a group taken from that, from the population, and usually it's well, in most cases or all cases, it's smaller than the actual population. Because, say, for example, if we're looking at, say, a country, it might be difficult to survey an entire population or an entire country. So we might take a small sample from that, so it's more manageable. A census collects information about everyone in the population. I kind of mentioned that already before. And bias occurs when the results of a survey do not reflect the population. So if there's some issues um, in the survey or in the results, and it doesn't accurately represent the population, then we could say that there's some bias that occurred. So there are different types of sampling you can do when you're surveying a population or surveying a sample from a population. We have simple random, and in simple random, everyone has an equal chance of being selected. Simple random, so everyone has an equal chance of being selected. It might be like putting a name into a hat and then randomly drawing a name, or pulling a number from, say, like a bingo wheel, or just randomly pulling a number. Similar idea. Everyone has an equal chance of being selected. Stratified random. Here we break into groups. So we break our sample, our population, into groups. Then random sample then we random sample from each group. So we break our population up or sample up into groups, then we random sample from each group, and each sample is proportional. So what that means is, say we're looking at a high school, right? We want to survey students. So we have grades 9, 10s, 11s, and 12s in our school. Now, if we would do that, if we wanted to do stratified random, we would break our population up into groups, which we could do by grade, and then we would take a random sample from each grade. So we would select some students from each grade. Now, if we had more students in a certain grade, we would randomly select more students from that grade, right? So we are keeping it in proportion, right? So if I had more grade 12s, my random sample would have more grade 12 selected than, say, grade 9s or 10s or 11s, right? So we're keep making sure that the sample is proportional to the overall population or the larger sample that we're pulling from. Voluntary response, kind of simple, or it's kind of in the name. People volunteer to answer. So everything's voluntary, right? It's kind of like, say, your survey questions that you kind of see on YouTube, right? It's voluntary that you answer. You don't actually have to answer, right? It could be, say, like if you get a random phone call that asks like about sample or wants to ask you questions, someone randomly asks you on the street, and you can either choose to stop and answer, or you just continue walking on. Cluster sampling. So a cluster sample, you break into groups. So you break them into groups, or you break up your sample or population into groups, then ask all individuals in a random group. So say, for example, if we are surveying students, we go into the class, or we go into the cafeteria at lunch, and we randomly select, like the students are already broken up based on tables, and then we randomly select a few tables, and we ask everyone sitting at those tables, right? So they're broken up into groups, and we ask everyone in random groups. Convenience, we sample where individuals are easily accessible. Right, so convenience is just basically whoever's easiest to ask. Right, so maybe if we're doing a survey and people in class, or students in our class, that's going to be the easiest people to ask, right? Or you ask your friends and family, right? You don't have to go out and ask anyone. It's easy to ask people at home or that you talk to often, right? So convenience, just individuals that are the individuals that you're asking are easily accessible, or it's convenient for you. Systematic, every nth person is selected. Right, so this would be an example where I order, or I line up all my individuals, right, or I put them all into a spreadsheet, and I say I want to interview, or I want to select every 10th person or every third person, right? So it's still random. There's a little bit more of a system to it. I'm selecting a specific person in my list every time. That's systematic sampling. Now we're just going to look at a couple examples, look and try to identify the population, what the population is, what the sample is, and the type of sampling, as well as if there's any bias that might occur in the survey or how I'm sampling. So a high school vice principal enters the school cafeteria and randomly selects 2 tables. All students at those tables are surveyed. So what is the population? What is the large group that I am surveying, or I'm trying to gather information on? In this case, the larger group would be high school students. Maybe it's students at that school, or maybe just high school students in general, but I am the larger population that I'm looking at, or I'm concerned about, is just high school students. The sample is the 2 tables in the cafeteria. So the 2 tables in the cafeteria, that is my sample. That is who I'm actually asking. The type of sampling, well, we kind of already mentioned it. We're breaking up our population into groups and selecting everyone at those groups, or in those groups. So this is cluster sampling. Is there any bias that can occur in this survey with this type of sampling? The answer is yes. Yes, there could be, if you think about it. Because generally speaking, when you sit with someone at lunch, usually you're sitting with people or friends, or your friends, and generally that tends to be people in the same grade, right? So yes, there is some bias, or there could be some bias, and the fact is that there's maybe only one grade There's only one grade at a table. Right? So if you ask everyone at the table, right, that might just be all grade 10s. Right? So you're not getting a good idea of high school students, right? You're only getting one grade. Students from my math class are given a survey assignment. Matt goes home and surveys his immediate family. Right? So what is the population? Well, if we're working on a survey assignment, again, it could be high school students or it could be maybe families. Right? We're not really sure what the assignment is, but generally speaking, if I'm giving it to my students, then maybe it is I'm curious about high school students or their families or people in the community. So students or families in my class. What is the sample? Well, the sample in this case would be Matt's family. That's who he's going and asking. The type of sampling. Well, Matt's not really putting any effort into this. He's just asking the people that are closest to him. So that would be convenience. Maybe they are the right target audience, maybe not. But he's just going with whatever's easiest for him to access for his sample. Is there any bias? Yes, there would be some bias, right? Unless his family is large, he's probably has a small number of people in that sample, right? So we have a small sample size. If we have a small sample size, and that generally means we only have like maybe a few people. We have a few data points to look at, so our data may not be as accurate as we would like. If we asked more people, then perhaps we would get different opinions or different answers. Right? So having a small sample can be a source of bias. 10% of a school is surveyed in proportion to the number of students in each grade. There are 300 grade 9s, 350 grade 10s, 270 grade 11s, and 330 grade 12s. Right? So our population would be, our population in this case would be high school students again. The sample would be 10% of the school. So our sample is 10% of the school. The type of sampling, because we're breaking our population up into groups, and then we're taking a proportion from each group, this would be stratified. Stratified is breaking up into groups and choosing some from each group or a proportion from each group. Is there bias in this survey? Now, you might argue that, well, you're only asking certain people, or right, we don't know who's being picked. We can assume that we're randomly sampling once we know how many students from each we'd be taking, right? So in this case, I would say that there's no bias, right? Because everyone, or at least each grade, is fairly represented, right? If there are more grade 10s, right, in the school, so more grade 10s would be asked, right? There are less grade 11s, so the less grade 11s would be asked. So because of this, right, every group is represented in proportion to how many there are, right? Or how many there are in the school. Right? So they're fairly represented. Right? So what we looked at today was, again, just different ways to sample, looked at some of the definitions or the different types of methods, as well as just looking at some examples and some scenarios, trying to identify the population and sample, as well as the type of sampling. We also looked at if there's any bias in some of these sampling methods or some of these scenarios. So we're trying to get an idea of what to look for and what to think about when we hear about these surveys or these studies, and how they're selecting their participants.